My name is Jake, and I never thought my life would turn into a story like this. 3 years ago, I married Caitlin, a woman who seemed to be the embodiment of everything I dreamed of. She was beautiful, with long brown hair that fell softly over her shoulders and eyes so green I sometimes got lost in them, like a forest after a rainstorm. But it wasn't just the looks. She had a way of making me feel special. When we met, I was working as a manager at a small electronics shop in the suburbs of Chicago, and she was freelancing, designing websites. We met by chance at a coffee shop. When I spilled my latte on her laptop, I apologized for about 10 minutes, and she just laughed and said it was a sign of fate. 6 months later, we were living together, and a year later, I proposed to her on the shores of Lake Michigan, under a sunset sky that was as warm as her smile. I admired her. Caitlin wasn't just smart, she was cunning, in a good way. She always knew how to get out of a difficult situation, how to negotiate with a client who had already changed his mind about a project 3 times, how to make sure that even an argument between us ended in laughter and reconciliation on the couch with pizza. I looked at her and thought, here's a person who is always one step ahead. She was my rock, my inspiration. I even started to believe in myself more because she believed in me. When I got a promotion at work, she surprised me with a candlelit dinner with my favorite steak and a bottle of expensive whiskey, which we finished sitting on the floor and making plans for the future. We wanted children, a big house in the country, maybe even a dog, a golden retriever. Because Caitlin had adored them since she was a child, I was sure that my life would only get better with her. But everything changed in one day. It was an ordinary Tuesday, nothing special. I finished my shift early and decided to stop by the mall to buy new trainers. My old ones were all worn out. Caitlin was supposed to be home. She had said in the morning that she would be working on some urgent project all day. I'd even texted her to see if I could pick up something for dinner, but she hadn't responded, so I figured she was just engrossed in her work. It happened. I parked at the mall, got a coffee at Starbucks, and walked to the shoe shop, and that's when I saw her. She was standing at the exit of the jewelry shop, at the other end of the mall. At first I thought it was just a similar woman, you know, the way your brain sometimes plays tricks on you, make you think seem wishful thinking. But no, it was Caitlin. Her hair, her posture, even that blue jacket I'd given her last birthday. She was holding a small black bag, clearly from that shop, and she looked pleased, almost radiant. I frowned. See, she hadn't said she was going out, had she? Maybe she decided to surprise me, buy something for us. I was starting to make excuses, because I didn't want to think badly right away. But then a man appeared next to her. He was tall, taller than me, with short dark hair and an expensive coat that looked like it had been custom-made. He came too close to her, too confidently. They didn't hug, didn't kiss, but there was something about the way he leaned into her, the way she looked up at him, that made my heart clench. I stood there, coffee in hand, and felt the blood pounding in my temples. I didn't know what to do. Walk over, call out to her, walk away, and pretend I didn't see anything. But my feet carried me forward, though I still wasn't sure if I wanted to know the truth. I walked through the crowd, trying not to lose sight of them. They headed toward the escalator, and I followed them, keeping my distance. Caitlin said something to him, and he nodded, and then they turned towards the car park. I watched them walk up to a black BMW, a car we definitely didn't have. He opened the door for her, and she got into the passenger seat like it was a familiar thing to do. The car moved off, and I was left standing there, looking at the empty seat where my wife had just been with some strange man. My mind whirled. Who is he? A client? A friend? A lover? I tried to remember if she'd mentioned anyone who might fit the description, but nothing came to mind. She'd always been open with me, or so it seemed to me. I knew her laptop passwords. She didn't hide her phone. We even joked that we had no secrets from each other. But this was the secret, and it hit me right in the chest like a hammer. I walked back to my car, got behind the wheel, and just sat there for about 20 minutes, trying to figure out what I had just seen. The coffee went cold in my hand. I didn't even take a sip. When I finally drove home, there were hundreds of thoughts swirling around in my head. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she was preparing a gift for me, and the guy was a jeweler or a salesman. But then, why didn't she say she was leaving? Why did she get into his car? I felt my faith in her crumble like a sandcastle under a wave. Caitlin, my Caitlin, the woman I admired, was suddenly someone else, and I knew this was just the beginning. Whatever it was, I had to find out the truth, even if it tore my heart. I was driving home, and each turn of the steering wheel seemed harder than the last. My head was chaotic, as if someone had taken all my thoughts, thrown them into a blender and pressed a button. My hands were shaking, and I didn't even notice. I'd missed my turn. I had to turn around at the next junction. Caitlin still hadn't responded to my message about dinner, and that silence now felt not like a normal bussiness, but something ominous. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe she'd just left her phone at home. Maybe this guy was a distant relative she'd never mentioned. But the more excuses I came up with, the less plausible they seemed. By the time I parked in front of our house, I was on edge. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Our house was small, 2 stories, with white walls and a small front garden that Caitlin liked to decorate with flowers. Usually the side of the place caught me, but not this time. I opened the door and walked in, expecting to hear the tapping of her laptop keys or the sound of water from the kitchen where she might be making tea. But the house was quiet, too quiet. Her jacket, that blue one, wasn't hanging on the coat rack by the entrance, where she usually left things. I made my way into the living room, then into the kitchen. There was an empty coffee cup on the table, but the laptop she always kept close by was gone. I went upstairs to our bedroom. The bed was neatly made as it had been in the morning, but her bag in which she carried her work stuff was gone. She wasn't home. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall. My brain clung to details that had seemed insignificant before. Over the last couple of months, Caitlin had been getting more delayed with projects. She said she was taking more orders, so we could save up for a house out of town faster. I believed her, was proud. Even my wife is such a hard worker, so determined. But now I began to remember the moments that didn't add up. How she would sometimes go out to talk on the phone in the backyard, closing the door. How she came back late one day, smelling not of her usual shampoo, but of something pungent, masculine. I asked where she'd been then, and she said she was meeting a client at a cafe, and I just nodded without thinking. What an idiot I was. I pulled out my phone and opened our correspondence. The last message from her was in the morning. "Have a good day, sweetie. Love you." I texted her again. "Are you home? Buy anything for dinner." And waited. The minutes stretched like hours. 10 minutes later, the phone vibrated. "I'll be there soon. The project is taking too long. You don't have to buy anything. I'll figure something out." I stared at those words and felt something inside break. She was lying. I saw her at the mall, with that guy, with a black bag in her hands. It wasn't a project. It was something else. I decided not to answer. Instead, I stood up and started looking around the house, as if I were searching for clues. I didn't know what I wanted to find, but I needed something that would either confirm my fears or prove that I was crazy. I checked her desk. In the corner of the living room there were only old bills and a couple of pencils lying around. Then I opened the bedroom wardrobe. Her clothes were hanging in place, but I noticed that one pair of shoes, the black-heeled ones she only wore to important meetings, were missing. I went down to the basement where we kept junk, but nothing unusual there either. That's when I remembered her laptop. She always left it at home, unless she was working somewhere outside the office. But it was gone, so she took it with her, where it was in that black BMW. I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, feeling both like a detective and a fool. Time was passing, and I began to imagine what would happen when she came back. I wanted to ask her straight out, who was that man? What were you doing at the mall? But I knew Caitlin. She knew how to get her way. She would look at me with her green eyes, smile the same smile that made me melt, and say something like, "Oh, that was a client. He wanted to discuss a project over coffee, and then we stopped by to pick up a gift for his wife." And I would have believed it, or pretended to believe it, because I didn't want to ruin what we had. But this time it was different. I couldn't just swallow it. I got up and went to her nightstand by the bed. She kept all sorts of little things, their hairpins, hand cream, an old diary. I opened the drawer and started poking around. Nothing interesting at first, just junk. But then, under a stack of old receipts, I found a small piece of paper. It was a business card, black, with gold letters, Nathan Reynolds, financial consultant, and a phone number. I'd never heard that name before. She hadn't mentioned any Nathan. I flipped the business card over. The back was handwritten. "Call me when you're ready." The handwriting wasn't hers. I squeezed the card in my hand so hard it crumpled. Nathan. It could have been him. Tall, in an expensive coat, with a car that cost more than I made in a year. My mind drew pictures. Caitlin with him at the restaurant, in the car, somewhere else. I could feel the anger rising inside, but behind it was fear. What if this wasn't just a chance encounter? What if this had been going on for a long time? I remembered how she hugged me less often in the mornings, how she sometimes fell asleep with her back turned to the wall. I thought it was work fatigue. Maybe it was more than that. When I heard the sound of a car pulling up, I quickly slipped my business card into my pocket and went downstairs. Through the window, I saw Caitlin getting out of the taxi, not from that BMW, but from a regular yellow sedan. She looked the same as always, beautiful, confident, with a bag over her shoulder and a laptop in her hands. She walked in, smiled at me, and said something about having a rough day. I nodded, but everything was boiling inside me. I knew I couldn't keep quiet. Not today. I wouldn't. But I also knew that if I started now, I could lose everything. Or maybe I'd already lost everything. I just hadn't realized it yet. Caitlin walked into the house, shaking raindrops off the sleeves of her jacket. A small spring downpour had started outside, and her hair was slightly wet, sticking to her neck. She set her bag on the floor by the door, and tossed her keys on the hall table like she always did. I stood in the living room, still clutching my phone in my hand, and watched her. She looked tired, slight shadows under her eyes, her shoulders slumped. But that tiredness seemed suspicious to me now. Was it real, or was it a mask she put on to keep me from asking questions? I nodded at some little thing she'd thrown in about the weather, and went into the kitchen to get some water, just to keep my hands busy. As the faucet rumbled to fill my glass, I tried to collect my thoughts. Nathan Reynolds' business card was burning my pocket like a hot coal. I wanted to pull it out right now, toss it on the table, and see how she reacted. But something was stopping me. Maybe fear that she'd lie and I wouldn't be able to prove otherwise. Or worse, that she'd tell the truth, and that truth would be one I couldn't live with. I took a sip of water, cold and tasteless, and heard her turn on the TV in the living room. Just an ordinary evening, as if nothing had happened. She sat cross-legged on the sofa and flicked through the channels. The screen flashed with news, adverts, some old sitcom. I leaned against the door jamb and watched her. Her laptop was lying next to her, closed, and I noticed the power cord was still in her bag, meaning she wasn't going to work right away. That was weird. If she'd been on a project all day, why hadn't she opened the laptop to show me what she was working on? She used to like to brag about her designs. Even if I didn't understand much about her work, I asked myself if I had noticed little things like this before, or if I just didn't want to see them. I sat her down in the chair across from her, trying to look relaxed, though I was trembling inside. She looked up from the TV and smiled a short, familiar smile. I nodded back and stared at the screen, where some guy in a suit was selling a blender for $19.99. The silence between us stretched on, and I could feel it getting heavier by the second. Usually we chatted about all sorts of things: work, what to make for dinner, plans for the weekend. But today, I couldn't get a word out of my mouth. Everything I wanted to say stuck in my throat like wet paper. Finally, she got up and went into the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open, a can of soda pop clinking. She came back with two. She handed one to me, even though I hadn't asked for it. It was her gesture, a small thing that had seemed nice to me before. I took the can, cold and slippery from condensation, and mumbled something like, "Thank you." She sat her back down, opened her soda, and took a sip. I looked at her hands, thin fingers, short nails, no ring because she took it off when she worked on the computer. Nothing out of the ordinary, no sign that she'd been anywhere but home or the office. But I knew it was a lie. I decided to start from afar. I asked her how her day had been, trying to keep my voice even. She shrugged, said the project was more complicated than she thought, and the client kept changing the requirements. Her voice sounded calm, even a little annoyed, like she actually spent the day working. I nodded, looking at the jar in my hands, and asked where she was, at home or somewhere else. She hesitated, just a little, but I noticed. Said she was working from a cafe nearby, because the internet was glitchy at home. I knew that was a lie. The internet was working fine this morning. I'd looked at the weather forecast myself before going out, but I didn't argue, just nodded again, feeling something inside clench. She changed the channel to some cooking show, where a woman in a brightly colored apron was chopping onions. I stared at the screen, but all I saw was that black BMW and that guy in the coat, Nathan Reynolds. I pictured him sitting across from her in some expensive restaurant, her laughing at his jokes, his hand on her shoulder. My stomach twisted. I set the can on the table and said I was going to take a shower. I needed to get out of the room so I wouldn't explode. Under the hot water, I tried to get my thoughts in order. The business card was the key, but I didn't know how to use it. Should I call in? Right. Run the number through the internet. I could check her laptop, but she never left it without a password, and I didn't know what one she'd put in after the last update. I could ask directly, but what if she denied everything? I had no proof other than what I'd seen at the mall, and a crumpled business card in my jeans pocket. I turned off the water and stood in the bathroom, staring at the fogged mirror. My reflection was as blurry as my life at that moment. When I came downstairs, Caitlin was already cooking dinner, just pasta and sauce from a jar. Nothing special. She stood at the cooker, stirring with a spoon and humming something to herself. I looked at her and wondered how the woman I loved could become such a stranger. The smell of tomato sauce filled the kitchen, and for a second everything seemed normal. But it was an illusion. I sat her down at the table, picked up my fork, and started eating when she placed a plate in front of me. The food was warm, but it tasted like cardboard. We ate in silence, only the forks clattering against the plates and the TV blaring in the living room. After dinner, she said she would go to bed early. She was tired. I nodded and stayed to clean the kitchen, even though we usually did it together. When I heard her coming up the stairs, I pulled a business card out of my pocket and looked at her again. Nathan Reynolds. I opened my phone and typed his name into the search. Nothing specific, a few social media profiles, but none were from Chicago. Then I dialed the number from the business card, just to check. There was a long ringtone, and then the answering machine came on. "This is Nathan. Leave a message." The voice was deep, confident. I dropped the call, feeling my palms sweating. I knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow I would find a way to find out more. But for now, I just turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, knowing that next to me lay a woman I no longer understood. The next morning, I woke up before Caitlin did. She was still asleep, curled up under the blanket, her breathing quiet and even. I stared at her for a minute, trying to remember the last time I'd felt warm looking at her, but all I saw now was the shadow of the woman I had admired. I got up, dressed quietly, and went downstairs. The coffee maker hissed, filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma, but even that couldn't make me feel better. Nathan Reynolds' business card lay in the desk drawer where I'd hidden it. And I knew I had to do something today. I couldn't wait any longer. While the coffee cooled in my mug, I sat her down with my phone and typed his name into the search again. This time I added Chicago and financial advisors. After a couple of minutes, I found a page on some local firm's website. Nathan Reynolds, 38, an investment professional, smiling in a photo wearing a strict suit. His face was unfamiliar, but I remembered that guy from the shopping center, tall, confident, in an expensive coat. It could be him. I opened the tab with his contacts and saw the same number as on the business card. No coincidence. I heard footsteps upstairs. Caitlin was awake. She came down in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, and mumbled something about the cold morning. I nodded, not looking at her, and told her I needed to get to work early. She didn't ask why, just poured herself a coffee and went into the living room. That was good for me. I grabbed my keys and jacket and walked out of the house, feeling my heart pounding in my ribs. I wasn't going to work. I was on my way to the truth. The address of Nathan's firm was listed on the website. An office in the city center, half an hour away. I parked across the street from the building, classy and modern, and waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I needed to see him with my own eyes. An hour later, he came out, same height, same dark hair, only now wearing a gray suit instead of a coat. He got into a black BMW, the same one I'd seen at the mall. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. It was in. I could have gone after him, but instead I came home. Caitlin had already left a note on the table, gone to work, back for dinner. Her laptop was gone again, and I realized this was my chance. I knew she didn't trust cloud services and often saved files directly to her hard drive. We had an old external drive that she sometimes used for backups. I found it in a wired drawer in the basement, plugged it into my laptop, and started poking around. There was no password. She didn't think I'd get in there. Nothing interesting at first. Old projects, photos from our wedding, some documents. But then I came across a folder called NR. I opened it. There were scans of checks, bank statements from a bank account I didn't recognize, and a few photos. One showed Caitlin sitting in a restaurant with Nathan, laughing, a glass of wine in her hand, and the other, they were standing outside a building, and he had his arm around her waist. The dates on the files are for the last 6 months, and on the statements, transfers for thousands of dollars, signed counseling. It wasn't a project, it was a scam. I sat her there in the basement, among the dusty boxes, and it all came together. She wasn't just cheating on me, she was using me as a cover, while she was doing something with this Nathan guy. The money she was saving for the house was going somewhere else. I remembered how she started talking about work more often, how she avoided details, how her tiredness became the norm. This wasn't a spontaneous affair, it was planned. When she returned in the evening, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. The business card, printouts from the disc and photos were on the table in front of me. She walked in, saw it, and frownsy. Her face went pale, but she didn't cry. She didn't scream too, she just stood there and watched. I didn't scream either. I just said I knew everything, and asked how long it had lasted. She was silent for a minute, then sat across from me and started talking. She didn't make excuses. She didn't lie, she just laid out the fact. She and Nathan had met at one of her projects, and he had offered her business. She forged invoices for his clients, and he paid her for it. Love was a bonus, she said, but I didn't believe her anymore. I packed my bag that night and left for my brother's. A week later, I filed for divorce. She didn't argue, didn't try to get me back. I saw Nathan on the news a couple of months later. He'd been arrested for fraud, and Caitlin had been named as an accessory. I felt no joy, only emptiness. The woman I'd admired wasn't just a stranger, she was a criminal. But now I knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. I started a new life, one step at a time, leaving her in the past where she belonged.